The scent of baked ham and citrus glaze hit me before I even stepped through the door. Same table, same polished wine glasses, same laughter that always seemed to arrive just before I did. I let myself in. No one ever came to greet me and hung my coat on the same brass hook I used to get scolded for touching. Weston's voice echoed from the dining room. We finally hit the 3-month waitlist mark full capacity, even with the downtown expansion. 3rd clinic already. That's incredible, Ivy said, her voice feathered with pride and performance. I stepped into the room, and no one turned. I might as well have been the draft from the open door. Vivian appeared a moment later, dressed in pastel silk and pearls, not a hair out of place. She hugged Ivy, then Weston. When she got to me, she offered a brief pat on the arm like I was a coworker at a funeral. You made it, she said, more observation than welcome. I always do, I replied quietly. The plates were already served. Ivy had made sure of that. Everyone had a seat. Mine was at the end, slightly apart. As always, a glass of cheap wine waited for me, the good bottle already poured for everyone else. I said nothing, as Weston launched into a story about his clients' celebrities. Of course, I placed my purse under the table, keeping my fingers curled around what was inside. My chest tightened, but I kept breathing, steady and invisible. Vivian sat at the head of the table, her face turned to each guest like she was hosting a press conference, not a family meal. The conversation rolled around me, never through me, then, after dessert. She stood with her wine glass in hand. This was tradition, the annual toast to herself, disguised as praise for her offspring. I just want to say how proud I am, she began, her voice warm and artificial. Of Weston, for opening his 3rd clinic. Of Ivy, for winning the Regional Marketing Award. Of my beautiful grandchildren, who never fail to impress. She paused, her gaze sweeping toward me like a scalpel. And I'm proud of all my children. Her smile widened, except for the parasite who still thinks she belongs here. Laughter broke like glass across the room. Ivy bit her lip. Weston chuckled into his glass. Their spouses joined in politely. I didn't move. Not right away. Then I reached down, slowly, and pulled out the small black box from my purse. I placed it gently on the table between the fruit salad and the pie. Exactly where the carving knife once left a mark from a childhood accident no one remembered but me. For you. Mom, I said, my voice even. Happy Mother's Day. And then I stood, pushed my chair in, and walked out of the room, out of the house before anyone could speak. My footsteps were the only sound I heard, until the screen door slammed softly behind me. That morning, I laid out my clothes like armor black slacks, navy blouse, sleeves stiff from starch. The watch sat beside them, the one Dad gave me the week before he died, gold-plated, the strap still a little too big for my wrist. I wore it anyway. It made my hands feel steadier. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, adjusting the buttons, smoothing the collar, brushing away lint that wasn't there. The woman looking back at me didn't smile. She hadn't in years, not the kind of smile that reached her eyes. But the lines on her face had softened. I wondered if that was peace or just exhaustion pretending to be calm. My purse lay open on the bed. I reached in and touched the box again. Small, matte black, no markings. But it felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. Inside, it was everything Vivian spent decades hiding. 2 years of research, bank statements signed in her name, audio files, screenshots, copies of emails, notarized transfers, letters of withdrawal, the original voice message from the Arts Academy, the one I replayed once a week for 6 months before I learned to stop flinching. At first, I gathered them like someone hoping to be proven wrong. Maybe I'd misread things. Maybe I was dramatic. But truth doesn't waver when you line it up next to itself. It gets sharper. I never planned to use the box. Not really. I thought just knowing would be enough, that maybe truth without confrontation could still be a kind of justice. But every family gathering, every smirk, every "we're all just doing our best" made that fantasy thinner. I zipped the purse closed and took one last look at the room around me, quiet, cluttered, but mine. I didn't own much, but everything in here had been chosen, not inherited. The cheap nightstand, the dusty sketch pad, the books with creased spines. Even the dent in the wall from a broken frame felt more honest than any photo in Vivian's hallway. The cab texted that it was outside. I slipped on my shoes and walked out the door. The black box pressed close to my side. The cab pulled up to the curb in front of the house I used to call home. The lawn was trimmed perfectly, the hydrangeas blooming in unnatural symmetry, the front windows polished to a cold gleam. It looked exactly like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened on the outside. I stepped onto the porch and rang the bell, even though I knew it would be pointless. Laughter trickled from inside, mixed with the clinking of dishes and the low hum of classical music. No one answered. They never did. I let myself in. "Look who finally emerged from her studio," Weston called from the dining room. "We were starting to think you'd been consumed by acrylics." I didn't answer. He knew I hadn't painted in years. I'd sold my last easel when I couldn't make rent, but that never stopped him from using artist like a punchline. Ivy walked over with a glass of wine, pale pink, sweet, and cheap. Mom said to start without her. She's still fixing her hair, she said, smiling just enough to stay in character. "We saved you a seat." She didn't say where. I followed her into the dining room. Weston was already halfway through his second drink, his wife laughing beside him. Two kids ran circles between the kitchen and the back patio, a row of perfect smiles, matching outfits. Everyone had a role here. I was just the echo. Vivian entered right after I sat down, perfectly composed in pale lavender, not a wrinkle in sight. She moved through the room like a hostess at a charity gala, hugging Ivy, kissing Weston's cheek, scooping up one of the grandchildren with a dramatic coo. When she got to me, she rested a single hand on my shoulder, then moved on before I could stand. No one asked how I'd been. No one asked if I was working. No one mentioned the part-time teaching job I'd taken or the small check I'd received for licensing one of my old illustrations. That version of me didn't fit the script. I helped set the table, filling in the empty spaces with cutlery and folded napkins. Ivy had already done most of it, of course, but she handed me the butter knives like a peace offering, and I took them. I was the only one without a partner, the only one without children. My name wasn't on any degrees hung on these walls, but I was there. I always showed up, and in my pocket. The box stayed warm against my hip, waiting. The last time I sat at this table and truly believed I belonged, I was 17. I still remember the envelope thick, with embossed lettering that caught the light when I turned it in my hands. The National Design Institute, my name printed in blue ink. A full scholarship, housing, a path. I'd run into the kitchen holding it out, breathless. Vivian was plating dinner, still in her blazer from work. She took the letter without looking at me, read it in silence, then placed it flat on the counter. "Art," she said, as if it were a diagnosis. "Calla, are you serious? It's a full ride. They only choose 12 students nationally." She wiped her hands on a towel and looked at me like I'd told her I planned to join the circus. "Weston's in pre-med. Ivy just got into honors economics. And you want to draw?" I opened my mouth. But she had already turned away. A week later, I got a call from the institute. The woman on the line sounded regretful. There had been a miscommunication. They understood I'd chosen another school. The offer was being retracted. I hadn't applied anywhere else. I remember standing in the hallway, staring at the wall as she spoke. The phone pressed to my ear, my heart pounding loud enough to drown out the rest. I didn't ask questions. I didn't cry. I just nodded, said thank you, and hung up. It took more than a decade before I found the truth. I was helping an old professor archive student files when he mentioned he'd once written me a recommendation. That's what pushed me to file a request with the Institute, to ask if they still had anything on record. They did. A scanned note on my file. A call logged the day after my acceptance. The line had been recorded for documentation purposes. When I asked for the recording, I expected static. Maybe a stranger's voice, but it was her. My daughter has reconsidered. She said, "We appreciate the opportunity, but she's pursuing a more stable option, even in that moment, even knowing what it cost me." Her voice was calm, respectable, polished. The administrator emailed me the file. I saved it. Then I saved it again. In 3 different drives. I didn't confront her. Not then. I still lived in the guest room back home. I still believed, somewhere deep down, that this was what love looked like. That maybe she was protecting me from failure, but love doesn't erase your name from your own story. And as Weston passed the salt, and Ivy wiped a smear off one of the kids' cheeks, I touched the black box in my pocket again, certain now of what had to happen. The laughter after her toast hung in the air longer than it should have. It was the kind of laugh people offer when they know they're supposed to, when the cruelty has been disguised well enough to pass for a joke. I sat still for a moment longer, letting the sound roll over me like a final wave. Then I reached down and unzipped my purse. The black box sat at the bottom, snug between a folded tissue and an old lipstick I hadn't worn in months. I pulled it out slowly, letting its presence interrupt the rhythm of the table. Weston paused mid-sentence. Ivy's smile faltered. I placed the box squarely in the center of the table, between the flan and the fruit salad. "For you, Mom," I said. "Happy Mother's Day." Then I stood, turned, and walked away. The door didn't slam. My footsteps were soft. I didn't look back, not when I reached the hallway, not when I opened the front door, not even when I stepped outside and let the air hit my face like a second breath. I made it halfway to the street before I heard her. The scream tore through the stillness like glass shattering. Not a theatrical gasp, not a wounded protest. A raw, broken sound that started low and cracked upward, as if her chest had finally split open. Inside that box was everything she built her identity on, unraveled. The trust fund drained in small, careful increments after Dad died. The account was in my name, intended for my college education. The withdrawals were signed by Vivian, redirected to Weston's med school and Ivy's first startup. There were bank statements, signatures, notarized copies. There were letters from 2 galleries, both of which had initially accepted my early portfolio. Both retracted weeks later, citing reputational concerns. I found out last year that someone had emailed both places anonymously, accusing me of plagiarism. The emails traced back to an account registered under her phone number. And of course, there was the voice recording, the scholarship call. Her voice, steady and decisive, informing the administrator that I'd turned down the offer in favor of a more practical career path. That file alone had taken months to obtain. It was the first thing I placed in the box. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted to put the truth in her hands and walk away without begging anyone to believe me. So I did. And as I stepped into the quiet of the street, leaving the house and all its shadows behind, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. The second scream came as I reached the sidewalk. It was shriller this time, laced with something closer to panic. Then another voice, Weston's, sharp and demanding. A chair scraped against the floor. Glass clinked hard against wood. Someone shouted my name. I kept walking. The spring air felt heavier than it should have. Not suffocating, just full. Like the atmosphere had finally caught up to the weight of everything unsaid for years. The neighborhood looked the same as always trimmed lawns, porch flags, a wind chime on the corner house playing something soft and tuneless. Ordinary things. I hadn't noticed them before. I think I notice everything now. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it. 3 steps later, it buzzed again. Then again. I stopped under a sycamore tree and took it out. The screen lit up with missed calls. Weston twice. Ivy once. Then a number I didn't recognize. The kind she would use when she didn't want her name showing up. I watched the screen go dark again. Then I powered the phone off completely. And just like that, the silence returned, not the kind that comes from holding your breath, but the kind you feel when the tension finally releases its grip on your ribs. My shoulders dropped, my hands loosened. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been clenching them all afternoon. I kept walking, no destination, just forward. For years, I told myself I was waiting for the right time, that maybe things would change, that maybe if I just stayed quiet, it would all balance out in the end. But silence never fixed anything. It just made more space for people like her to speak louder. I passed the corner and crossed into the next block before I finally stopped looking back. The black box was gone. The house was behind me, and in front of me. For the first time in a long time. There was nothing but road. The call came 2 days later, just after noon. As I stood in line at the corner cafe, Calla Renshaw, the voice asked, "This is Elise, from Holloway West Gallery." I stepped out of line. "We met a few years ago." She continued, "You submitted a portfolio back in 2019. I'm not sure if you remember. I did. They'd expressed early interest, said my brushwork had something unresolved but deliberate. And then, nothing. Silence. A rejection with no explanation. I hadn't painted since. I don't mean to surprise you," Elise went on. "But your mother came by yesterday. She was upset. Said something about a box." I didn't speak. "She demanded we remove a file from our system." Elise continued, "The one with your work. She said it was fraudulent, that you'd used stolen concepts. But I remembered you. So I pulled the file." There was a pause. "We never deleted your work." She said, "Not really. The system flagged it as unconfirmed, but I archived the portfolio." I leaned against a lamppost. My legs felt far away from my body. "She also left something behind. A wooden case, old, scratched, looked like it had been in storage. It had your name taped to the bottom." I opened it. My breath hitched. Brushes, professional grade, used, but carefully stored. Some still had dried paint on them. They were mine. I'd thought I'd lost them during the apartment move 5 years ago. I searched every box, every closet. I assumed they'd been tossed out, but they hadn't been. She'd kept them. All this time. "Elise," I said quietly, "why are you calling?" "Because the gallery director saw your old pieces. He thinks your early work had promise. He wants to know if you're painting again. If you're open to resubmitting." I looked across the street where the sun hit the sidewalk in fractured light. "I'm not sure," I said. "That's okay," she replied. "No pressure. But if you want to see your brushes again, they're here. So is your work. Just say the word." After we hung up, I stood there holding the phone, the dial tone gone but still echoing in my ear. Then I turned and began walking home. 1 month later, I stood in a gallery under soft lighting, surrounded by 10 pieces that had nearly never existed. The black box, that's what I called the collection. Every canvas held a thread of what had been stolen, silenced, or shoved into drawers. I painted them late into the night, sometimes shaking, sometimes still. One was of a locked door, another, an open window. Most were landscapes fractured by bold. Broken strokes honest, unfinished, like I'd left room for someone to return. Weston showed up with his tie slightly askew. Ivy in a charcoal coat. They didn't speak much. They hovered near the walls like they were visiting a memory they didn't know they were part of. Weston read every plaque. Ivy blinked longer than necessary at a canvas I'd titled Inheritance. Vivian wasn't there. The centerpiece hung in the center of the room, larger than the rest. Soft and sea-toned. A reconstruction of a half-finished sketch I'd found among my father's belongings. I'd added light to the corners, a shoreline, a boat he never had time to paint. At the bottom right, I signed it C, Renshaw and Dad. I stepped back and looked at it once more, not as a daughter, not as a child trying to earn a seat at the table, but as an artist who had finally stopped asking for permission to be real. The gallery hummed quietly. Somewhere behind me, I heard Elise greeting someone at the door. I didn't turn around. My hands were covered in faint stains that still hadn't washed out completely. I'd learned to stop scrubbing them off. They were the only proof I ever needed that I wasn't a parasite. I was building something that could finally outlive her silence.